Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So this series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, 1967, Martin Luther King Jr. delivered a speech at Riverside Church in New York City condemning the Vietnam War. This is one of King's most famous speeches. We'll talk about its kind of place in the public imagination, but it is one of his most famous speeches, often referred to as his Riverside speech or his Vietnam speech, and it showed how he was becoming more outspoken about the war in his final years. I don't think we need much more of an intro, but I will point out that the title of the speech is actually Beyond Vietnam, A Time to Break the Silence, so maybe there's more going on there than just a speech about the Vietnam War. So here to discuss are, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Columbia and Kellie Jackson of Wellesley. Hello.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
And our special guest for this episode is Professor Peniel Joseph at the University of Texas at Austin. His latest book is The Sword and the Shield. Peniel, thank you for doing this.
Thanks for having me.
And let's start with you. Why Riverside Church and why the spring of 1967 for this speech?
Yeah, well, Riverside really announces Dr. King as a radical anti-imperialist revolutionary publicly. And King was really under a lot of pressure. King had come out against the Vietnam War in a quiet speech in some comments in 1965. The Johnson administration really pushes him back, and he's really silent for the next 18 months. Stokely Carmichael, who's a friend of King, who's chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and other folks within SNCC had released an anti-war statement in January of 1966. And he's under pressure to speak. And right before that speech, he sees an article in Ramparts magazine looking at the children in Vietnam and sort of Agent Orange. And that's why he says, in the speech, there comes a time when silence is betrayal. So he really is coming into his own here. And it's really the example of both the young people in SNCC. It's certainly Malcolm X's example. I write about that. But in a way, his conscience is bothering him through the preceding 18 months, 2 years. And so Riverside is when the dam finally bursts.
And is there a particular reason he goes to Riverside Church as opposed to some other venue?
Well, I think Riverside is a very, very important church for him in the sense that Riverside has a sort of progressive political tradition. It's sort of a peace church. It's an anti-racist church. There's a huge history of sort of Riverside being progressive, even when it's hard to be progressive. So I think that, and that speech is written in collaboration with Vincent Harding, the Black theologian who becomes the future organizer of the Institute of the Black World. So in a way, Riverside gives him a different voice than previous speeches that had been written by Stanley Levison, who's King's longtime collaborator, ghostwriter. Basically, Dr. King's like presidents of the United States who rarely write their own speeches. So sometimes people try to criticize him, but I just want everybody to know, even Barack Obama, a president like that. I suppose Thomas Jefferson wrote his own speeches, but I don't know. I think that might be the last one, Thomas Jefferson and Lincoln, presidents. I want everybody to know they're too busy. And Kellie and Niki know this to write their own speeches. They don't.
Yeah, a lot of them are, maybe editing the speech, I think is a little bit better, giving final, they'll read it, review it, and say, maybe I'll see this word over this word.
Exactly.
Or tweaking it, but, and of course they put their own spin when they speak it.
Yeah.
But a lot of the heavy lifting is always coming from other people.
Yeah. So Kellie, what do you think of when you think about this speech?
This speech is probably one of my favorite speeches. I have a lot of King speeches. I love Letter from a Birmingham Prison. Everyone talks about the I Have a Dream speech, but I love the part when he writes about America writing a fraudulent check.
Yes.
Is what he compares American society to. But this speech, I think, is so powerful because when I share it with my students, I let them know that King is not so beloved in this moment, that if he were, to have poll ratings, they would be exceptionally low. And how history works and how memory works are two totally different things. And so getting them to understand King in this moment, as opposed to how we remember him as MLK Day, are two totally different ideas. And in this moment, he's really pushing back on the state hard and talking about things that most people would think is borderline treasonous in terms of speaking out against America's role in Vietnam.
Yeah, I have the same kind of reaction because there's this debate that happens often around Martin Luther King Jr. Day, which is which Dr. King do you remember? Do you remember the Dr. King from the 1950s, or do you remember the Dr. King of this 1967 speech? Because it captures the radicalism of his message. And I think his message always had a radicalism to it. Yeah. But in particular, it's when his politics are once again out of step with the political establishment. And to be fair, with a lot of other Americans who are invested in the Vietnam War. What I find so fascinating about this speech is that there seems to be, and Peniel, you'll probably have a better sense of this, but there does seem to be an evolution in the way that King talks about Vietnam. In his early speeches against it, he talks in terms of guns or butter. We're spending all of this money abroad, and we're sending young black men to this country to be maimed and to be killed, when we should be working back here in the United States, and we should be spending that money here on domestic programs. I think in Beyond Vietnam, he is speaking into a larger anti-colonial, anti-racist movement that feels different in this speech than some of the earlier ones.
Yeah, and you can, I think you're exactly right, Niki, and you can really see the influence of Vincent Harding. Vincent Harding is one of the towering theologians and intellectuals and thought leaders, in American history. And a Black radical social gospel Christian. So when you see the lines, the United States is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. And for those of us who know about Vincent Harding from Hope in History or There Is a River, which is his masterpiece, you get the poetry where he says it's going to be a bitter but beautiful struggle to sort of redeem the soul of the nation. But then, he also says in that speech that the United States doesn't have the political maturity to confront itself, to face itself, right? And so this is the King who's talking about not just a beloved community and a revolution of values, but talking about the triple evils facing humanity, militarism, materialism, and racism. And what's so extraordinary in that speech is that King is confronting not just Lyndon Johnson, but the imperial state, capitalism, inequality. But he's asking all of us to confront it as well. And he does make the analogy. He says these Black and white soldiers are killing children in Vietnam, but they can't live on the same block in Detroit, he says. And, he's alluding to racial segregation and its persistence, right? And so it's really a really, truly extraordinary speech. Again, that asks all of us to commit to this revolution of values. And then finally, what he does, and I think he does it best in that speech, and I think I hear Harding and him again in lockstep, is that he has a very capacious definition of nonviolence in that speech. So he pushes back against liberals, against conservatives. He says it was easy to define nonviolence as just Black demonstrators suffering in the United States. And he said, I didn't get any pushback. But when I say nonviolence globally, and that we shouldn't be dropping bombs in Vietnam and Agent Orange, people call me a traitor. But then he pivots rhetorically and says that there's something wrong with a country that defines nonviolence that narrowly, right? And so King's vision of nonviolence, yes, he pushes back against Black powerites who are talking about violence or self-defense, but he also pushes back against law enforcement. And he also pushes back against the structural violence of poverty and inequality. So he's asking, and one great speech, he says that we should have no more military bases. We should have bases of peace and understanding around the nation. And he says in the speech, I'm serious, even though people are going to laugh and ridicule me. So his vision of nonviolence is quite radical and revolutionary. And that's why I think when I look at him and Malcolm, Malcolm pushes back, but then King always forcefully pushes back because he's always trying to, and I think at Riverside, he makes the best case to tell you how muscular his vision of nonviolence is. His vision of nonviolence is absolutely stunningly revolutionary, right?
Yeah, I think that, we sort of want King to just take on racism or just take on segregation or just take on voting rights and then leave it at that. But because he's like, no, this is all inclusive. Like this, everything is systemic and structural. It's not just about racism. It's literally about human rights, how we treat each other. This is global. This is not just unique to the United States. And I think that's more than what people can handle. Or want to handle or want to have to confront. And at the end of the day, people don't want to do any change that will cost them something. I don't think people are thinking about necessarily what it costs them for voting rights. Okay, I don't have to take money out of my pocket. But when it comes to these economic poverty, the Poor People's Campaign and all of this stuff, well, now you're asking me to dip into my pocket. Yeah, or war. Yeah. And people do not want to have to actually commit, make economic commitments in that way or economic sacrifices.
So what is your sense that King understood the interconnectivity and the structural issues at play all along and only felt at this point able to say it out loud? Or does he undergo an evolution of really starting to see how all these things are connected?
I think that King undergoes an evolution. I think it's easy to say that. And again, I've read the great scholarship of people like Thomas F. Jackson from Civil Rights to Human Rights, and this idea that King always had sort of radical intellectual social gospel leanings. I don't doubt that, but I do think that he undergoes an evolution during his 12-year political career on how to articulate this to a mass audience. And he goes from trying to do it in sort of the most inclusive, reform-minded way possible to after Watts realizing that that's not going to work at the level of change that's needed. Because King in 1966 is a supporter of a freedom budget that would be $150 billion over 10 years, and that's A. Philip Randolph. The country wasn't ready for that, right? And so that's when I think you see throughout 66 in Chicago and Black Power locking arm in arm with Stokely Carmichael, that you see the radicalism. And he even says in a speech beyond the Los Angeles riots in an essay that he's going to use nonviolence as a peaceful sword starting in the fall of 1966, right? 65. So I do think that King is imperfect, so he evolves. He becomes, I think, a better person and a better political activist over time.
So as we start to wrap up here, I do think it's worth talking about some of the reaction to this speech at the time. So the New York Times, the Washington Post, there's editorials basically saying this was a huge mistake, and pushing back against the speech. The New York Times in particular, in their editorial says, quote, linking these hard, complex problems will not lead to solutions, but instead to deeper confusion, which is interesting because it's not a criticism. It's sort of saying the very thing he's trying to do. I imagine King's response would be, that's my point, is trying to link the deeper systemic complex problems. I'm trying to be complex here, but that actually seemed to be the actual pushback.
Well, I would also add another way that he was attacked was to call him unpatriotic, to call him a friend of the Viet Cong. There was a quote in Life magazine where they said that the speech was demagogic slander that sounded like a script for Radio Hanoi. And it's certainly not the first time that Martin Luther King Jr. was called a communist. It was an attack that was aimed at him over the course of the 1950s and the 1960s, and it's kind of repackaged in this moment. And it's interesting the kinds of how it's just sitting there under the surface. There's this moment when he has some credibility with white Americans, and at the slightest change in his message, it's back to he's just a communist.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's no coincidence that he's assassinated exactly 1 year after this. I mean, there was a countdown on his life after this.
I mean, Peniel, on that, is that just one of those quirks of history that it was literally 1 year? How do you place that?
Yeah, I agree with Kellie. I think there was a countdown. I actually don't think it's a quirk of history. You know, the King family themselves don't believe that James Earl Ray was the only person connected to, or the person who connected to his death. Andy Young doesn't. So many of them don't. So, you know, he was under Memphis and FBI surveillance 24/7, and suddenly some random person crosses state lines to kill him. So that's certainly the historical record. But I do believe there was a countdown, and there's a reason he doesn't live to get to Resurrection City and be part of the Poor People's Campaign. He dies in Memphis helping the sanitation workers. But getting back to what we were talking about, the response, there's a great line where Whitney Young also criticizes Dr. King, and he tells him that just like the New York Times, because Whitney Young is the LBJ man, he says that, you know, you did the wrong thing there to link civil rights in Vietnam. And Dr. King tells him, he says, Whitney, that may get you a foundation grant, but it won't get you into the kingdom of heaven.
It's a pretty good line to have in your pocket. May I ever be in a position to use that line against someone? Okay, well, let's leave it there. This has been really fascinating. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
And Peniel Joseph, you want us to say a word or two about your new book?
Oh, sure. I've got a new book out, The Sword and the Shield, The Revolutionary Lives of Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, which delves into, among other things, Dr. King's Riverside speech.
Thank you very much. This has been really fantastic. This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported, artist-owned podcasts. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. Kaula Nakua helps with our transcripts, which you can find at our website, thisdaypod.com. Also on our website is a way to get in touch with us. There are bios for all of us, much more about the show, and a way to support the show directly if you would like. You can become a monthly member, or you can give a one-time donation. Thank you so much for doing that. Follow us on social media. We're at thisdaypod on Instagram and Twitter. My name is Jody Avirgan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
I wish to go on now to say something even more disturbing. The war in Vietnam is but a symptom of a far deeper malady within the American spirit. So such thoughts take us beyond Vietnam, but not beyond our calling as sons of the living God.
Radiotopia.